welcome back to The Independent Pianist. It's your host, Cole Anderson, as usual. And today I'm actually pushing back my next performance video to next week because I had a really interesting topic, at least for me, that I wanted to talk about while it was fresh in my mind. All my viewers may have already seen the video that I'm referencing in the thumbnail. There's a couple of videos that just came out that Rick Beato, quite a well-known YouTuber, put on his channel. Then there was also a video that Anthony Fantano made as a rebuttal. And surprisingly, I probably wouldn't have seen these videos at all, except they were recommended to me to look at, but I'm glad I did because they are very, very interesting and they bring up a lot of issues which are actually systemic of larger problems in the musical community as a whole and also beyond the musical community, just into the wide world. It's well worth going and taking a look at those videos. This video is not really a direct reply to Rick Beato or Anthony Fantano. Basically, there were a couple things that I thought were really interesting about the points that Rick Beato was making, and I'm just going to kind of go on a tangent and bring it into my own world, of course, which is a fairly esoteric one, the classical piano community. We're a small niche, but we're quite a brave one and quite passionate in our own way. Yeah, so basically, I'll just say first, I pretty much disagreed with everything that Rick Beato was saying, although there were certain things that actually are true in a limited sense about what he was talking about. So one of the things he was kind of talking about was how he feels that the technical innovations of the last 10 or 20 years have actually stifled innovation in music making. Not only innovation, but also originality. He was specifically talking about things like quantization for drum tracks and auto-tune, things that kind of regularize and allow a kind of mechanical perfection for singers or for a rhythm section. And it struck me at the time when I was hearing that, I suppose that could be true. It would depend, though, on how these kind of technologies were used. They might be capable of being used in a very original way, which is exactly what Anthony Fantano says in his rebuttal as well. But it also got me thinking about the ways in which technology have actually been so helpful for me in my musical career. If it wasn't for the existence of piano controllers like the Kawai VPC-1 that I use, and digital audio workstations, virtual instruments, and of course YouTube, I would never have been able to make something like this channel, and my career would probably have gone a very different way. I would probably still be languishing in obscurity somewhere, just teaching piano and kind of doing my own thing and playing concerts locally, but the outlet of having something like YouTube allows me to reach so many people that I would never have otherwise been able to reach. So there was something, a little bit elitist maybe about that kind of a comment, saying that you have to do it the old-fashioned way to a certain degree for it to really be meaningful. So like with the technology that I'm using, yes, it has made it a lot easier for me to actually get music recorded and get it out there so that people can hear it, and it seems like a lot of people actually enjoy hearing the sort of music that I make. But I've actually had to put quite a bit of work into the technology itself to actually make this stuff sound the way that it should sound. With these virtual instruments that you get for piano, I never found any of them that actually sounded the way I would have liked right out of the box. And so the one that I use, I've actually tinkered with and toyed around and experimented with different effects. Over the past 4 years, I must have put dozens of hours into that, just trying to figure out how to make the sound the best possible sound. And I think that's actually a thing, is that oftentimes technological advances can actually introduce more complexity. And for people who are really concerned about their art, they're actually going to put in a lot of time to make these things really work for what they're trying to do. But of course, you're always going to get people who are just looking to cut corners and do things in an easy way. And I'm sure it's quite true that a lot of modern technology allows this to happen even more easily than in the past. So that actually brings me to the main point that I wanted to talk about. This is something that I've thought about a lot in the past and talked about to a certain degree, but I don't think I've ever addressed it on this channel. And it's really convenient actually that these videos, Rick Beato's video just came out this last week, because I was just having a little bit of a conversation with one of my viewers in last week's comment section that kind of ended up coming back to this very point, which is, of course, golden age thinking. And this is a way of thinking which is just so prevalent in the classical music community, and especially in the piano playing community, and not just in classical music, in the wider world as well. And it's actually something that I've been aware of to a certain degree for as long as I've been interested in piano playing. And when I go back to some of my very earliest influences, the things that got me really excited about playing the piano, things like The Last Romantic documentary with Vladimir Horowitz. I remember him saying something kind of sliding about modern music in that video. It just very, very off the cuff. It passed by very quickly. He was talking about how there was some similarity between a Beethoven sonata and a Chopin scherzo. And then someone said, oh, there wasn't that much time in between them, only 10 years or 15 years in between those two, in the 1820s and 1830s. And then Horowitz said something like, oh yeah, nowadays in 10 or 15 years, what comes out? Meaning, of course, nothing good comes out now. So there is this kind of idea that, everything now has kind of fallen into a decline and the music's not like it used to be. And there really are psychological reasons for why we do this. I was actually reading a very interesting article which quotes a Swedish historian, Johan Norberg, and he actually says that this kind of nostalgia for the past is very natural, and sometimes it's even useful, because it anchors our identity in the past. It helps gives us a feeling of stability and predictability. And of course, the periods that we're usually most nostalgic about are the ones that align with our childhood. I'll never forget once, actually, a family member of mine was talking to my brother. It was when I was quite young, and my brother was just talking about some band from the 1950s that he knew about, which is kind of extraordinary because, he was born in 1980, and you wouldn't necessarily expect that he would know this music from the 1950s. And anyway, this other family member who grew up in the 1950s was saying, oh yeah, that was such a different time, everything was so pure then, and everybody was so innocent. And, I didn't really think anything about it at the time. I just thought, oh wow. But since then, of course, with a little bit of study of history and kind of thinking about things, what was actually going on in the 1950s? The Korean War, racial violence, the Cuban Revolution, all kinds of things. And I'm sure even young people, who supposedly were living such idyllic lives, they were probably getting into trouble as well and having their own problems during that time. I'm sure it wasn't quite as idyllic as you're thinking, but that's just the way it kind of goes. When we look back on the past, we tend to forget about the bad things and remember the good things, unless the bad things were so traumatic that they left a really lasting scar on us, of course. And so I find myself doing it as well sometimes, just thinking about the past and thinking about, oh, how great it was when I didn't have XYZ responsibility or problem or whatever. Of course, conveniently forgetting how tricky it was actually in that time for me, or how, the worries that I had or the problems that I actually did have. So how does this all relate to classical music and our little niche in the piano playing world? Music that's really at the avant-garde has a hard time getting accepted oftentimes. And what a lot of people don't realize is that this was always the case. It's not only the case now. Of course, I'm not talking about the top 10, Spotify most played songs. I'm talking about things that are really pushing the envelope. Music which now we absolutely revere as being a work of genius, and that's listened to all the time and studied. A lot of that stuff actually had a lot of difficulty finding an audience in its time. So take a piece that was really at the avant-garde in its time, like Beethoven's Hammerklavier Sonata, Opus 106, the biggest and most ambitious of all Beethoven piano sonatas. Well, this piece was considered by the musical establishment to be nothing less than the deranged ramblings of a kind of lunatic at the time. It was thought that Beethoven had completely gone off the deep end by many, and that this was just an impossibility, that no one would ever be able to play this piece. It would never find the mainstream. And that was actually still the case in the 20th century. So again, Vladimir Horowitz, when he was talking to one of my teachers, Mark Salmon was playing the Hammerklavier Sonata at that time, and Horowitz actually said something about how it was something like desk music. It was the sort of thing that you just look at your desk and you study it, and then you put it away and you don't really play it in public, because it can't really make an effect in public. The only real headway that a piece like that made after it was composed was when someone like Franz Liszt picked it up and championed it, and then suddenly people started to reevaluate it to a certain degree. But that was only one isolated occurrence. The piece still languished and lacked interpreters. Maybe there was Franz Liszt, maybe there was Hans von Bülow, and a few other famous pianists who actually picked it up. It was really like 100 years or over 100 years from when the piece was written in the 18 teens to the 20th century when it finally started to make a little bit of headway. And there were still people who didn't really accept it as a proper piece to play in concerts. And that was true for all Beethoven's later music. It was very weird at the time. Arthur Rubinstein, in his autobiography, talked about how equivocal he felt about playing Opus 90, which is a fairly harmless piece. It has kind of a song without words kind of quality to the second movement. But he said it was kind of an odd thing to play because it trailed away at the end. It didn't have kind of a big, satisfying conclusion. So he always felt a little bit funny about playing it. And of course, nowadays we don't have this feeling that we have to end in a blaze of glory, with every piece to please the audience. But they had these kinds of ideas at the time. So it was actually a very innovative kind of piece for its time. As far as a sonata goes, a sonata would usually have some kind of big conclusion. And people still, to the present day, talk about Bartók or Schoenberg as if that was modern music. They were writing in the first few decades of the 20th century, and that music still is kind of fighting for the acceptance which it deserves, in my opinion. And no doubt in another 100 years, it'll be, totally accepted and commonplace to listen to that music. So I'm always a little bit careful about this, So often you see comments which just even obliquely kind of bear out this kind of philosophy, and I think it's really tempting and it's really dangerous, and you need to be kind of careful about that because you are limiting yourself very much when you buy into this kind of golden age thinking, however useful it might be in certain ways. This is another thing that actually was in Anthony Fantano's video. It's well worth remembering that part of the reason why we tend to revere all this music from the past is that a lot of the crap that was written in the same time has actually kind of been washed away by time and history. If you look back at a period like the Viennese classical period, when you had Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven all working in the same little period of time in the same little geographical area, you think, what a golden age of music, all this great stuff that they were writing. And then we forget about the reams of music written by the dozens upon dozens of composers that we no longer remember at all. And some of that might be unfair, it might be unfair that some of this music has been forgotten and it should be rediscovered. But some of it is probably forgotten because the music didn't really have the kind of universality to it that would actually cause it to continue to be enjoyed over time in future generations. And it may have served its purpose at the time. It may have had a very good function and people enjoyed it, but for whatever reason, it didn't last. I'm always reminded of this piece that I accompanied once, the Stamitz Viola Concerto, which, sorry if you're a fan of Stamitz, I'm sure that there's excellent qualities to his music, but what I realized when I was actually playing the accompaniment for this viola concerto was, oh my gosh, this piece is actually really, really formulaic and repetitive and not really that interesting when you get into it. If you're a great violist, like that violist was a really good violist who played it, you can make it sound, kind of charming and lovely in its own way. But if you hear it more than a few times, you start to kind of feel like, oh, Jan, okay, he's going back to tonic and dominant again. Just kind of the same formulaic things repeated. And that was, of course, the language at the time. So if you just wrote stuff skillfully that was kind of using these formulas, that was enough. That's also sometimes why I'm mystified when people, start talking about, oh, how Mozart was such a bad composer or how X, Y, or Z was such a bad composer. Just the fact that they're remembered now pretty much means that they had something kind of unusual going on about them, because most of the music written at that time would have been kind of like the stuff that we have on our Spotify top 10 playlists now. Stuff that's really just appealing to the lowest common denominator to get as much popularity as possible. Not to say that all that stuff on the Spotify top 10 playlist is going to be forgotten, but probably most of it is. Well, Stamitz wrote reams of music, and I'm sure there are many other composers who weren't even as skilled as Stamitz was. Now, I'm not arguing that you shouldn't write music unless you're the best of the best. First of all, because we can't even really determine that now. All we can determine is what we enjoy or what we don't enjoy. And I think the very act of writing music and actually engaging in music is good for humanity. I think that's a really good thing for people to be involved in, and it's far better than a lot of the other really pernicious activities that we can be engaged in. So I don't think it's a bad thing that Stamitz wrote this piece. It's still useful now for violists to play, but it should give us a little bit of pause when we are hearing something that we really, our initial reaction is to say that we really dislike this particular piece of music. And we just make some kind of blanket value judgment like, oh, this is ugly. So just like I was saying actually in that comment section from last week, I think the really good question to ask in those situations is, why do I dislike this? Why do I find it ugly? Because then you can start to have an interesting conversation, and maybe you'll discover that really the reason you don't like something is just because you're not used to it, or because you're a little bit prejudiced against it for whatever reason. And those things are very natural. There's nothing to be worried about, but it's good to be aware of it so that you can really examine why you like something, why you don't. Maybe it has something there which actually you'll start to like if you just give it a chance, give it a little bit of time to kind of sink in. And I found that to be the case time and time again in my own experience. I think I did mention that once before on the channel in reference to Stephen Sondheim when he was talking about how the first time he heard the Berg Violin Concerto, it was noise, but the 10th time he thought, oh, this is beautiful music, which indeed it is. I think that whenever we're trying to expand our horizons, whenever we're trying to expand our understanding, it oftentimes is a little bit difficult and it's going to feel a little bit hard. So it's really, don't be scared of that feeling. Don't think there's anything wrong with yourself or necessarily with what you're being exposed to, but examine it and explore it, and then you can really make an informed decision. Hi everyone, Cole Anderson from the editing floor here on Saturday morning, and I realized that I left out some very important parts from my argument that I really need to address. Of course, that is that I didn't explain how this style of thinking actually relates to the piano world. It's mainly expressed when you hear quotes about how there are no pianists now with personality or that are interesting or doing anything interesting in the concert scene, and that only X, Y, or Z pianist really expresses, the golden age kind of style when people actually had personalities and when they actually did interesting things as pianists. I think I first heard the idea expressed explicitly when I was in college. It was right around 2008, I believe, or 2009, and the great English pianist Alfred Brendel was on his retirement tour, so I went and saw him play Beethoven's C minor concerto, one of his last performances in Cleveland. And I remember a fellow studio member was telling me about how, Brendel, he's one of the last of this tradition of golden age pianists, or some words to that effect. And that struck me as being kind of funny at the time, because I was probably one of the few pianists who was really into the older generation, some of the earlier pianists who recorded in the 20th century. So calling Brendel Golden Age seemed a little funny, although I liked Brendel too. But that was actually the way a lot of people looked at him at that time, because he was coming to the end of his career and had become something of an institution. However, if you went back in time to the 60s or 70s, when Brendel's career was just getting started, you would see people referring to him as kind of an example of an intellectual, a new wave intellectual and structural pianist, as contrasted to the older, more romantic generation. And that might be a fair enough summation. People might have thought of Rachmaninoff and Hoffman and people like that as being indicative of the true golden age of piano playing at that time, when things were free and they played with this kind of wonderful romantic style. Well, back up a little bit to the first few decades of the 20th century, and if we look at the writings of the influential music critic James Huneker, who in his writings was very much a romantic, I think that's pretty clear. He had this to say about Rachmaninoff, who we generally consider to be such an example of golden age romantic piano playing. He said, the oldsters were reminded of von Bülow, the same cold white light of analysis, the incisive touch, the strongly marked rhythms, the intellectual grasp of the musical ideas, and the sense of the relative importance in phrase groupings proclaimed that Rachmaninoff is a cerebral, not an emotional artist. Not Woodrow Wilson himself could have held the academic balance so dispassionately. Even the staccato Princeton touch was not absent. It's pretty funny to read that. So at that time, Honecker was looking back towards earlier artists for this kind of romantic golden age style, and Rachmaninoff was seen as being too modern, too objective. If only Honecker could have heard Alfred Brendel, eh? So by now it should be obvious that all these things are just a matter of perspective, and styles change, come and go. It would be wrong to say that personalities are just generally degrading over time. If Rachmaninoff is such a great personality, then why was he seen as being so limiting by someone like Honecker? Only because it was different in some way from what Honecker was used to. So if you hold to this kind of viewpoint, if you hold that all the great piano playing has already been done, and that nowadays we're in this inevitable decline, you're just closing yourself off to anything good that can come from the present day. I think that's really a shame. Because once you give people a chance in the here and now, you'll start to realize that there are indeed great personalities now. There are indeed great artists out there working. For myself, I just think of highly original pianists like Mikhail Pletnev or Pyotr Andrzejewski, Alain Grimaud, Stephen Huff, and many, many others who are at work right now and who are actually very original, very thoughtful, have great big personalities, and can really express themselves beautifully at the piano. So that's a little aside that I wanted to add to the video, because I realized I hadn't said anything about how all this kind of golden age thinking applies to the piano world. So back to me from a few days ago. Great. So those are some of my thoughts here. I don't know if this was at all useful, but feel free to go take a look at the originating videos as well. Rick Beato's videos and also Anthony Fantano's reply. I have them linked in the description box. Not like you probably need that help to find them. And leave your own thoughts in the comment section. I'd be, of course, really interested to hear what you have to say about this. And just be on the lookout, for instances where you might be indulging in some golden age thinking. Okay, thanks very much for watching. Take care. I'll be back next week with some more great music. This really will be a performance video next time. Take care, keep practicing, stay safe.